My guest this week is Chief Executive of Federated Farmers, about to hold the national conference in Ashburton this year. Conor English, welcome back to Rural Delivery.
Good morning, Roger.
Conor, I thought you might have to add an extra day to conference this year. There's a lot to talk about.
There's an enormous amount happening actually in the policy space at international, national and regional level and at sector level. So, it's going to be a very busy conference. So we're focusing on the water, we're focusing on youth and farm succession actually, and we're focusing on the reform agenda of government around the water and RMA stuff.
Okay, well, I'm going to add one more there because I am going to talk about the red meat sector.
Oh, absolutely. Well, our meat and wool sector are focusing on that as well.
Yeah, okay. Well, what's the sensible conversation going to look like around that?
Well, it's going to be interesting. I mean, from our perspective, it's all about, trying to achieve that T150 target. That's $150 for a mid-season lamb for our farmers, because that's what they need to be sustainable. And by sustainable, I mean profitably sustainable, and also enable to sustain their farms in an environmental sense. So it's really critical that we get to that $150 a lamb, and it's a very crystal and simple objective that we think needs to be achieved.
Within the industry itself, there's on-farm, there's processing, there's the export markets. Where does the focus need to be?
I think each of those three segments of the supply chain contribute towards the profitability of the farmer. We have anecdotal stories around, behaviour of our meat marketers, if you like, in the market. Are we extracting the maximum amount of value we can out of that market? Perhaps there's, some co-opetition that could go on there. In our processing side of it, there's been discussion around the capacity or overcapacity in the meat sector. I'm not so sure how relevant that is, to be honest. And then you've got the whole issue around procurement. So that's the interface between the farmer and the processor, and then of course what the farmer does on his own farm.
And when we talk about the market, we're increasingly talking about Asia and in particular China. How is that changing New Zealand farming?
Well, I think our marketplace is changing dramatically. We're seeing this massive shift from west to east, as China's now a very buoyant participant in the international marketplace, and has gone from number 10 to number 1 as our trading partner. And if you look across our agricultural commodities, it's our number 1 buyer of meat, mutton, wool and dairy. So it's very critical in the future of New Zealand farming.
Let's move on. Water.
Yep, water is huge. The big issues around water is, the issue around ownership is something that the government is dealing with, but we're just keeping that off the agenda for us. We think all New Zealanders own the water, but its quality, its management, and its storage. In terms of water quality, the big issue there is proposed regulation around diffuse discharges, nitrogen in particular. And our view is that needs to be around good management practice. Things like overseer are a helpful tool, but they should absolutely not be used as a regulatory tool. And we've got some councils and some officials who think that would be a useful thing to do. We don't. We think that would be a big mistake. So if they go down that overseer route, and we're trying to talk them out of it, it would be a shame to see them do that. But if they follow what we want them to do, which is to focus on what actually happens on a farm, what actually impacts on an environment, and what is practical and reasonable to do, then that will be successful.
Let's talk briefly about that other lifeblood of rural growth, broadband.
Well, look, broadband is absolutely critical to our rural infrastructure. If we want people living in the countryside, we have to have broadband. If we want to improve our productivity and be connected with our international markets, we have to have broadband. So we've worked really hard. We got $250 million to get extra from the government to get $300 million put into rural broadband initiative. Now we're talking to the government about making sure that the 700 megahertz spectrum, which is going to be auctioned because our TVs have been turned off, the old TVs have been turned off, we want to make sure that the rules around that ensure that we get good coverage at a reasonable price in our rural areas.
One last thing. You've waded into the whole Unitary plan debate in Auckland. Why is Federated Farmers getting into that?
Oh, well, look, what happens in Auckland actually is important, just as what happens out of Auckland is important to Aucklanders. If our farmers aren't making money, that doesn't flow through the Auckland economy. The reason we're specifically concerned, though, about the plan changes that they're proposing up here is that the Reserve Bank Governor and the government are actually pretty interested in it as well. If we have a housing bubble up here, the Reserve Bank Governor is going to put interest rates up. That's going to put upward pressure on the dollar, and that's going to have an impact, a double whammy impact on farmers directly. And that means their debt's going to cost more to service because their interest rates will be higher, and their incomes will be down because the dollar will be higher than otherwise would be the case. So what happens in the Auckland housing market matters enormously to farmers. They may or may not realise that, but it's what we're keeping an eye on.
Conor, certainly sounds like a fascinating conference. Thanks for joining us.
Cheers.